Maybe God can't interfere in our affairs.
So I've noticed.
Maybe he can, because to do so would spoil his plan for the future. Some evolution of man and the world so unthinkably beautiful that it's worth all the pain of every suffering thing that ever lived.
I say it's spinach and to hell with it.
You're convinced that God is dead because there's evil in the world.
Correct.
Then why don't you think he's alive because of the goodness in the world?
What goodness?
Everywhere, in man.
You're committable.
If we're nothing but atoms, molecular structures no different in kind from this desk or that pen, then we ought to always be rushing irresistibly blindly toward serving our own selfish ends. So how is it that there is love in this world? I mean love as a God might love. And a man will give his life for another.
Never happened.
Of course it happened.
Give me one example.
It happens all the time.
Name one example.
Hello there. That quote from the film The Ninth Configuration will soon make sense to you. But in the meantime...
This is blasphemy! This is madness!
Today on Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, I, Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. But we're often too afraid to do so because you bought into the lie that in this surveillance, neo-Puritan, echo chamber age, you couldn't make a difference. That if you rebel, they will numb your soul and deploy their angels equipped with their neuralizer from Men in Black.
You ever have that feeling where you're not sure if you're awake or still dreaming?
But that's not true. For you are the consummate soundtrack of the counterculture. So beautiful in so many ways for all eternity. And you're going to discover this, as well as new heroic dimensions of yourself you never thought you had. Like Carl Jung wrote, your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens. And like another Gnostic saint, W.B. Yeats wrote, whatever we build in the imagination will accomplish itself in the circumstances of our lives.
My father says that almost the whole world is asleep. Everybody you know, everybody you see, everybody you talk to. He says that only a few people are awake, and they live in a state of constant, total amazement.
It is said in the Gnostic Gospels, specifically the Christian Sethian ones, that the Demiurge's great sin, after he had formed the world from chaos, was that he claimed he was the only God and there was no God but him. This is obviously taken from Isaiah 45. Joseph Campbell agreed that was Yahweh's great sin, inasmuch as he forgot he was a metaphor, blind to the infinite light of which he was a local historical manifestation. One scholar said that Yahweh's sin was actually monotheism, that this was a darkening of the human condition, where the wondrous spirit world of levels of divinity and magical possibility were gradually shut down, and all forces of the universe were centralized, kind of like a despotic government.
People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people.
Our own egos do that, you see, blocking out all curiosity for the sublime and imaginative, under the lash of our mechanical desires from a lizard brain dressed in Dawkins sensibility. Don't forget this, and know from here on out you no longer can be forced to forget. Your life is transcendental, a sublime metaphor from a great light that will kick ours in its local historical manifestation.
Don't you see? It's not about you. It's about them.
But I can't go back.
Don't know that you got a choice, son. No man can walk out on his own story.
And speaking of Dawkins, on this January, the year of our demiurge 2018, we have an incredible show that will certainly raise the hackles of both many atheists and certainly some orthodox theists. That is because we have the pleasure of being joined by Perry Marshall, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his game-changing book, Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design. Thought-provoking and soul-liberating book, easily grasped by someone like me who tends to be scientifically challenged.
Why did all the dinosaurs die out?
Because you touch yourself at night.
Perry makes a sound case that randomness and meaningless are nowhere part of evolution or nature in general. That there are certainly intelligent forces behind creation, all with solid science and reason, and sans any dogmatic pontification. I've enjoyed Perry's writings on both evolution and SEO marketing for years, and it's great to have him on. For more information on Perry, including his wager to scientism to disprove his ideas, please go to cosmicfingerprints.com or check out our show notes.
I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use.
Both members and non-members will get the entire Sophia of Perry. We conducted the interview in the thick of the holidays, so time was limited. Health was also limited due to a flu, but we hope to have Perry back on in the near future to discuss his ideas on artificial intelligence and the Book of Genesis. However, we do have a bonus for subscribers and patrons. Something new and perhaps something constant, if you true secret warriors dig it. We will have a threesome discussing Perry's interview and also evolution, coding, intelligent design, and DNA from a Gnostic point of view. It will include yours truly, Vance and Scott Smith, author of God Reconsidered, a book that deals heavily with the same themes Perry addresses. I found our little discussion powerful and useful and concentrated gnosis. But let us know what you think. I say.
Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
Of course, the Gnostic viewpoint would say there is an intelligence behind the cosmos, but it's not so intelligent. Evolution shows harmony, but it also shows cancer, birth defects, species that don't make sense, and other oddities like why we got the dinosaurs and Julia Roberts. But reason and faith and gnosis are the cornerstones of a liberated individual. And revelation continues to be downloaded from the eternal realm. Like the Valentinian sage Theodotus once wrote, scientific knowledge is necessary both for the training of the soul and for gravity of conduct, making the faithful more active and keen observers of things. For as there is no believing without elementary instruction, so neither is there comprehension without science. And tying into our interview with Perry, a warning relevant to today, it was John Brunner who wrote in his short story Judas, quote, We've been slaves to our tools since the first caveman made the first knife to help him get his supper. After that, there was no going back, and we built till our machines were 10 million times more powerful than ourselves. We gave ourselves cars when we might have learned to run. We made airplanes when we might have grown wings. And then the inevitable. We made a machine our god.
What is the Matrix? Control. The Matrix is a computer-generated dream world, built to keep us under control.
But enough of my drivel. Led us to the interview with Perry Marshall on his book, Evolution 2.0. And then to an incredible discussion with some Gnostic jokers and thieves. This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Perry Marshall to discuss his book, Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design. How are you doing today, Perry?
I'm great. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be with you, and we're going to go on a fascinating adventure today for sure.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, two Chicago guys, what could go right?
That's right. Well, it's not St. Patrick's Day, so hopefully we won't create too much of a disaster.
Amen. And with us, always a pleasure to have is Vance. How are you doing today, Vance?
Okay, Miguel, the day is evolving quite nicely.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. With design. Well,
right.
Except with my kids. Now, that's random.
Even chaos has design within it.
Well, it does.
So anyway, tell us, Perry, it seems that your book, Evolution 2.0, and your venture is at its core a story of you and your brothers really adventure together, an adventure of faith and coming to terms with things. Is this close, or could you just maybe tell us how you came to write your book?
In fact, one of my really astute friends said, "You know what your book really is, Perry?" And I said, "What's that?" He goes, "Your book is a love letter to your own brother." And
Exactly.
I thought, wow, I never really thought of it that way. But yeah, it's also a love letter to my passion for science and engineering. And, and maybe even in a very roundabout way, kind of a love letter to the creator, because I see such extraordinary order, in the cosmos. And so, yeah, the story begins. Really, I have to go back to us growing up. We're both pastors' kids. We grew up in the super conservative Nebraska church community, and I kind of strayed, like, not in a big way, but definitely loosened up as I got older. Like, I wasn't as dogmatic, and I was more interested in exploration. But he kind of just stuck with the party line, and he went to California, and he got a master's degree in theology at a super conservative seminary, and he was prepared to be a pastor. And then he ends up becoming a part-time missionary in China, and he lives in China for 4 years. And at the end of 4 years, he was almost an atheist, which that was interesting. In fact, this kind of started maybe a year and a half in. He started like scratching this itch and asking all these questions, and he'd send me all these emails, and we're pretty close. In fact, today he's the president of my company. And so all this discussion starts going on, and he's tearing the whole thing down to its engine blocks, and he tries to see if he can put it back together, and he can't really figure out how to put together. He's dragging me into it, and he's throwing a lot of questions at me that I'm just drowning. And now I had a lot of these kind of conversations with a lot of people already, and I thought I'd seen everything. But man, you have not had those conversations till you've had them with a guy who's got a master's degree and knows Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and knows where all the bones are buried, all this kind of biblical stuff, right? And so I'm floundering a little bit, and I found myself in this particular conversation we were having. I was visiting in China, and half the time we're in China together, we're arguing. And I found myself retreating to science, and I go, Brian, look at the end of your arm. I said, this is a nice piece of engineering, and I should know because I'm an engineer. And I said, you don't think this is an accumulation of random accidents, do you? And he goes, hold on. And he pushes back with a pretty standard Darwinian kind of an answer. Like, no, you don't need a designer. You just need millions of years and lots of chances and lots of natural selection and survival of the fittest. And you're going to get stuff like this. And you don't need a designer. And I listened to that and I thought, well, A, I don't really buy that, but B, I might be wrong. And I know I might be wrong. And I was trying to be 5 chess moves ahead of him, in the conversation, right?
Yeah, brothers.
And I thought, okay, I already know without even discussing this any further, there's a whole bunch of biologists that would agree with him and they would disagree with me. And how do I know I'm right? Maybe they know something I don't know. Maybe there's whole entire departments in biology that an electrical engineer has no conception about. Maybe he's right. And at that point, I just decided to stop arguing. And I decided that when I get home from China, I'm going to start reading and I'm going to buy books and I'm going to go obsessive on this thing. I'm going to find out. And I think I might even let science determine the answer about this for me, because he was dragging me into this kind of against my will, but I had to be intellectually honest. And so I flung myself into the void and I said, okay, I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. I know, so we could argue about theology all day long. I've done that all my life. My dad was a pastor and I know all those games. In fact, theology is kind of squishy. So you can always just kind of change a position on something and the conversations will just go round and round in circles. But science and engineering isn't always like that. It can be, but usually it's not. Electrical engineering is really precise and it's not squishy. So you know what? I've got an electrical engineering degree. I'm scientifically literate. I can pick up a scientific paper. I can figure this stuff out. So here we go. And I went. And well, I couldn't have imagined all the things that I was going to find, but it ended up being an astounding journey in what I feel is the biggest untold story in the history of science. And that's a big statement, but I'm serious. I think this is just totally mind-blowing, and it's a shame that people don't know, but I want people to know, and that's why I'm here. And I'm glad. I'm really thankful that you read the book and that you invited me on your show.
Oh, really enjoyed your book, Perry. Like we talked before, I've read your blog for many years, but your book, again, put it all together, and it really made sense. We should probably start by the idea of code, since it's central to your book. And today, code is very trendy. I mean, that's people use that language, the Matrix, even Elon Musk saying that the universe could be a simulation with code and so forth.
Right.
So tell us, or tell the audience, why is code so important to understanding evolution 2.0?
Well, so we all now swim around in a world full of code, right? So you and I are recording this conversation over Skype. We text people, we email, and it's all ones and zeros, right? You text your friend and the ones and zeros go out and then they come back in and it all gets decoded. And, so we all live in this, right? Well, I had this particular advantage of understanding code, which was I wrote an Ethernet book in 2002 in a previous life when I was selling industrial equipment. And this largest trade association of industrial process engineers asked me to write a book for them, and I did. It's now in its 3rd edition this year. And so I would have never guessed that this had anything to do with evolution. But Brian and I got in this argument, and in our argument, he was saying, well, if there was a random copying error of DNA and there was millions of falcons flying around and there was millions of copying errors it would just be inevitable that every now and then one of those copying errors would be better. And then you get a better falcon. It could hunt better, see better, whatever. And so like natural selection just does its work and you don't need any designers. And I thought, okay, I know the biologists believe that, but they never taught me that in engineering school. And I've never seen anything like that in engineering. So like, well, what are these people talking about? And are they right or are they wrong? And so I dug into that question. And so I was studying DNA and trying to understand, okay, so if there was a mutation, what is a mutation? And, well, it's a copying error. And what would that do? And I'm studying DNA, and all of a sudden I had this giant, like my head almost exploded. And it was, hey, wait a minute. Like half the stuff that I wrote about in that Ethernet book is also true of DNA because it's digital code. So DNA is digital code on a spiral strand of chemicals in a helix, but it's basically just ones and zeros. And like from a data point of view, it's no different than Ethernet or Wi-Fi or texting or cell phone signals or anything like that. It's all just ones and zeros. Oh my word. Like I can figure this out. Like all of a sudden I realize like I know where to start. And by the way, that is an excellent starting point. It's like one of the most foundational things in biology, which is the genetic code, which you can look up in any biology book, and so, there's a code that says when you press an A on your keyboard, what are the ones and zeros that are going to go to the CPU, and there's a code that says, well, if, GGG makes glycine and AAA makes lysine, and you have code going to amino acid, which turns into proteins, which turns into cells. And so, okay, this is a great starting point. Well, all right. So I went down the rabbit hole and all of a sudden this is all making sense. Well, I discovered two things. Is number one, nobody knows any way to make a code without designing one. Okay. Which is really interesting because you have this question of where did life come from? Now I want to circle back to that because there's a whole lot more about that. A lot of people kind of oversimplify this and jump to conclusions, and I don't want to do that. So make sure that we circle back to that. But then there was a second question, which is, okay, so how does evolution actually work? And I realized, well, since this is all digital code, then that means that evolution is basically a software engineering problem. And so I can start asking questions about, well, if I'm looking at, looking at a giraffe and then somebody's saying it evolved into a zebra, I ought to be able to look at the genetic code and figure out what the steps were because there would be a trail in the DNA that actually suggests that. And that's exactly what I found. But what I found was my brother, he's not a scientist. He's a really, really smart guy though. And, he studied evolution. And what he read was what is in most of the evolution books, which said, yeah, well, you got all these falcons flying around and they have random copying errors in their DNA. And once in a while, it makes it better. Well, I wrote an Ethernet book and I know that a copying error never makes it better. Ever. Like it's impossible. If you know how codes are put together and how fragile they are, they have all kinds of error detection and error correction. And, the fact that you can go down the interstate with your cell phone and watch a YouTube video while you're in the car with the engine noise and the spark plugs and everything else. It's just a miracle of modern technology because there's all these systems that correct the errors. And what I found out is cells have these same kind of systems. In fact, they're scary how similar they are. The cell is scary similar to your cell phone in that when it gets a corrupted signal, it's like, hey, could you resend that? There's all these things that cells do to fix dirty data. And this prevents birth defects and stuff. And not only that, I found out that cells self-evolve, that this doesn't happen by accident. Now, man, I've already thrown a mouthful at you already, and we've only been talking for like 10 minutes. But this just opened up a whole universe that I never knew existed, in which I didn't find in any of the popular evolution books. But it was in the scientific papers. And so, man, this just, it set my brain on fire.
Agreed. And for the listener, he does a great job at explaining this. And I love your summaries at the end of each chapter, because somebody who is science challenged like me, I could say, okay, point by point by point. Makes sense. Mm-hmm. Very logical. So basically what we have is that it is impossible for non-intelligence to create code. Is that the crux of things, Perry?
And evolution, both.
And evolution, yes.
Okay, and so man, this just really sent me down a rabbit hole. So let me give you an idea of what I discovered. So I was really perplexed for a while, and let me explain why. So I figured out DNA is a code. There's 1 million codes, 999,999 of them are designed like HTML and PHP and Chinese and zip codes and barcodes. Like all these things are designed. There's no codes that aren't designed, and there's this one code and we don't know where it came from. And it's called DNA. Okay. And furthermore, I knew that random copying errors can never create evolution. And so if I had just stopped there, I would have just basically been some flavor of creationist or some flavor of intelligent design advocate, and that would be it. But there was one thing that troubled me. And the one thing that troubled me was I had done a lot of other reading, and I had actually become convinced that a overall general evolution story really did seem to be true. Okay, so I was not able to bring myself to reject the overall idea of evolution. Like there's some people, they just throw it out. They're like, no, it's a hoax. Like there were special events in creation, etc. God made zebras and God made rabbits, that sort of thing. I was not convinced that was the case. I looked at a lot of evidence and I said, boy, we've got to, like, for example, whale feet. Okay. And if you go to a museum that has a whale skeleton hanging up, you will see that suspended in the middle of the body, not really sticking out or anything, but inside the flesh are these little, they look like leg bones or flipper bones, but they don't really do anything. Okay. Now, if God made whales like from scratch, you just wouldn't really figure you'd put these bones just hanging in the middle somewhere. Okay. Yeah. But what it looks like, if you put on your engineering hat, it looks like the whale is hanging on to the structures and it's just shrunk them down to where they barely take up any space. Okay. Which genetically is the case. Okay. And I'm looking at that and I'm going, well, first of all, that wouldn't happen by accident. Okay. Nothing like that would ever happen just by chance. Okay. It's a highly coordinated set of changes just to shrink those bones down. And, they used to be legs as far as anybody can tell. I mean, it has every indication. And so I'm looking at this and I'm going, man, it sure looks like the whale evolved from something else. But I don't see how that's possible, because that would never happen accidentally. It would have to be coordinated. And so I was sitting there going, well, everything I know about code says this has to be coordinated, but everything I can look at, like from paleontology, says that there was an evolutionary story. It couldn't have happened by accident. So how could that happen? And I was just sitting there with this question for a couple of years, and I was looking around and I wasn't finding an answer until one day somebody sent me this link to a paper, and I went and looked at it. And this guy named James Shapiro was telling this whole story of this woman named Barbara Mcclintock. Now, Barbara Mcclintock is absolutely one of the greatest scientists of all time. And in fact, she has her picture on a U.S. postage stamp. In 1944, she was doing these experiments with corn plants. And she was damaging DNA chromosomes with radiation like a hacker. And she was trying to figure out what the corn plant is going to do when she does this. And she's doing these experiments, and it was like she threw the plant a curveball, and the plant threw a curveball right back at her. And she was really puzzled. Like, what is this? Well, let me give you an analogy to what happened. It would be sort of like, okay, so imagine that I gave you a 350-page novel and I tore page 186 out and I gave it to you and I said, okay, page 186 is missing, but I want you to read this thing and figure out what's missing and fill it in as best you can. Now, if I gave that assignment to a decent writer, do you think they could figure out a way to do it?
No, it'd be hard.
It'd be hard, but you could interpolate, right? Or even it's like if you skip a page when you're reading it,
right? Yes.
What comes later, you can kind of guess what's in there, right? So, like a really good writer could probably fool most of us into not knowing that it was ever missing. They could copy different concepts or different sentences, and they could even imitate the style. Well, this is basically what this plant did. She damaged part of the DNA of this corn plant. The plant couldn't reproduce. So the plant went and said, hey, so I'm going to grab this gene over here and this transposon over there and this thing, and I'm going to put these back together, and I'm going to fill in the missing page, and then my mystery novel is back to okay. And this is exactly what her corn plant did. Okay. And then it went on and it reproduced, and she could figure out from the corn kernels and from her microscope, she could figure out what all had happened. And she actually spent 7 years scrupulously documenting all of this. And in 1951, she gave this presentation at Cold Spring Harbor, New York. And she said, hey, you know, I damaged the DNA of this corn plant, and it reconstructed its own genes, and it went on to reproduce. Basically, the plant evolved in real time.
Wow.
And they thought she was crazy. In fact, half the people in the room laughed at her, and the other half were mad. They were like, who is this woman? Where does she get this idea that plants can engineer their own genetics? We all know that genetics builds the plant. The plant doesn't build the genes. Like, we all know this. And they wouldn't take her seriously. And in fact, she got so much hostility from this that she just stopped publishing her results for the next 20 years and kind of went underground with this research, but she kept doing it. Well, Barbara Mcclintock won the Nobel Prize in 1983 for discovering transposable elements. And what those are, they're sort of like, you know, adjectives or adverbs or something like that, where when you move them around, it changes the meaning of the sentence. Okay. And what this plant had done was, when it was damaged and it didn't know what to do, it started restructuring its DNA and rearranging things the same way we would rearrange a blog post, and it fixed itself. And that plant evolved literally in hours after she had damaged its DNA. Okay. And she was the first person to do an evolution experiment and then understand exactly what happened between step A and step B. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. Well, so what most people have never been told is this completely changes our understanding of evolution. Evolution happens as an active process that's orchestrated by the cell. It does not happen by accident. It absolutely doesn't happen by copying errors. It happens as a proactive adaptation based on what's going on around it. The temperature, the food, the the water, the salt, the nutrients, the predators, all of that stuff, hundreds of things. And cells are constantly making adjustments to the epigenetics and the genetics of their own DNA in order to respond to the environment. And those changes can be passed to offspring. And so this basically puts a stick in the spokes of all of the old school evolutionary theories that everybody's been taught for the last 75 years. It's totally game changing.
Oh, I agreed. And for the audience, he gives other examples. It truly is amazing. There is something there. But what about arguments against you? And of course, in your book, you give examples, having to sit there in basically atheist conferences and having people basically shout you down. And also, you are known for some very fabled online arguments. Those all arguments that go for hundreds of pages and days and nights. And one argument that you take care of early, and that sort of came up in my head, and then you address it maybe 2 chapters in, and that's the idea that, hey man, codes are found everywhere. They're found in sunlight and snowflakes. Well, real snowflakes, not like liberal snowflakes, but real snowflakes. What do you say to that?
Yeah, well, so this goes back to my thing that I wanted you to circle back to, which was all DNA is a code. All of the other codes are designed, therefore DNA is designed. Okay, and the actual facts do support that, and there's really no counter argument. And so in 2005, I got invited to Willow Creek Church, which is the largest church in Chicago, and I gave this talk called "If You Can Read This, I Can Prove God Exists." And it was basically just an argument for divine design in living things based on information from an information technology guy, which is what I am. And so I gave this talk and I put it on my website, and I started debating this online. And this one guy got really frustrated trying to debate me because he wasn't going anywhere. I kept backing him into a corner, and he says, hey, Perry, I posted a link to your talk over here on this forum. Well, it was on infidels.org, which at that time was the largest atheist website in the world. Right, and they had this giant forum. And he posted a link to my talk, and he says, hey, you guys, I've been talking with Perry Marshall. Be nice to him while you rip him to shreds. And I'm like, oh no. I don't want to deal with it. Oh, not these people. Oh my word. Well, Perry, you were fixing for a fight and you just got yourself one, like first class, man. So here you go. I'm like, I couldn't really turn it down. Right. So here I am, like, okay, so I got to defend myself. So I did. Well, they tried to argue all kinds of crazy stuff. They tried to tell me that snowflakes are codes. No, they're not. They don't have digital code. They don't have an encoder. They don't have a message. They don't have a signal. Oh, sand dunes are codes. Water is codes. Sunlight is codes. Like, no, no. If you understand what a code is, none of those things are code. HTML is code, and PHP is code, and DNA is code. But, rocks in the bottom of the ocean are not code. So anyway, this went on and on. This ended up being the longest running, most viewed thread in the history of the largest atheist website in the world. It went for 7 years. And 7 years later, I would still show up about every 3 or 4 months. And I go, all right, has anybody come up with anything new? No, I guess not. Right. And I would reiterate what I said before. I'd say, show me a code that's not designed. All you need is one. Show me a code that's not designed. And I just put the burden of proof on them. I said, look, if you guys are right, you should be able to prove this really easily. Go do your homework and stop trying to change the definitions. That whole thread, the whole forum, it all eventually got shut down and it went away. But they never solved my problem. But had this frustration because I still had this blog. People would still come along and they would try to make this tired old argument. And one day I had this epiphany and I thought, hey, Perry, you need to tell them how to prove you wrong. Like, spell it all out, write a specification. Here's how you show that you came up with a code without designing one. And so I wrote a specification and I said to the guy, I said, if you can solve this, I will write you a check for $10,000. And I put it out there and he went silent. It just killed the conversation. He had nothing more to say. And I kept trying this on people and it worked. I'm like, I'll be darned. Like, I didn't know this was going to work. Well, so let's fast forward a little bit. And I want to kind of reframe this whole argument a little bit, because what I'm all saying is true, but it doesn't mean that there's not a way to solve it. It might be solvable. And the longer I studied this problem, the more I came to realize, if somebody ever did figure out how to get chemicals to code, how to get a code without designing one, that would be a huge breakthrough. And it might be possible. How do you know it's not? And so I kind of changed my whole flavor of what I was doing with this thing. And what I did was I said, you know what? Somebody might solve this. If they do solve it, it's probably one of the top 10 discoveries of the entire 21st century. It would have huge implications for artificial intelligence, for medicine, for genetics, for maybe psychology. I mean, who knows what? Be absolutely huge. And we should put money behind this in case somebody can solve it. And so I went and I started pitching investors. I started a corporation called Natural Code LLC, and we put together a $5 million technology prize, and it's called the Evolution 2.0 Prize. And if you go to naturalcode.org, you can see that prize, and you can look at all the specifications. You can see if you can win it. I have judges from Harvard, Oxford, and MIT. They're some of the best scientists in the entire world. The guy from Harvard and MIT is the lead geneticist from Harvard, and his name is George Church. He's been tied in with almost every major development in genome research in the last 30 years. He's had something to do with it. So I've got an all-star team of super quality scientists, and we really want to solve this thing. What we won't permit is people making up stories about warm ponds and lucky lightning strikes and happy chemical accidents and pretending we know.
Like Richard Dawkins.
Oh, right. Richard Dawkins. I heard him on a radio station. It was an NPR station one time. Somebody calls in. He's the world's most famous atheist. Somebody calls in. They go, so where did life come from? And he goes, it was a happy chemical accident. And he just goes on. And I was like, wait, did he just say that? Are you kidding? He actually said that. He's a professor at Oxford, and doesn't he have any respect for this problem? Like, you got to be kidding. Like,
making
I can't
theological assertions, philosophical.
Oh my goodness. I can't believe he doesn't get fired for saying stuff like that. That's absurd, right? And so it was like this glib, disrespectful, I'm just going to make something up attitude. Like, no, this is life, man. Like, this is the biggest mystery in the universe. You don't just sweep it under the rug like that. And like, a lot of people want to do this. You ask them where life come from, they'll just make up a story. Like, no, you don't do that. That's not science. And see, I understand on the other side, like, if I go, okay, it's a code, all the codes are designed, therefore God did it. Like the talk I gave in 2005. If a scientist says, Perry, I'm a scientist, I can't just like say God did it, let's go out to lunch. I totally respect the science that says that. I got lots of friends who are scientists, and I understand them, right? And so, like, I'm not saying we got to jump all the way to God. Who knows how many layers there are between God and us? I mean, my goodness, right? That's like a whole nother discussion. But we have to respect the question, and we have to respect science, and we can't make stuff up. And so It's been a really interesting journey to put this thing together, and I'm really interested to see if somebody can solve this thing.
Oh, agreed. And for the audience, please go to cosmicfingerprints.com. It's all there if you want to take it on or get some really great information. And what about you, Vance? Do you have a question for Perry?
Oh, yeah. Maybe I should enter this contest, too. In my work, one time I designed a self-describing protocol that kind of generated itself. But the problem is, there was code that I wrote it in, so it was only code creating another code. That probably doesn't count.
Well, it doesn't count, but it's interesting, and it sounds evolutionary. I mean, look, let's go back to Barbara Mcclintock's corn plant, okay? That's like the novel that rewrote a page of itself, right?
It depended on a particular characteristic of the language I was looking at. It can look at its own data structures. So what I did is I wrote the program to look at its own data structures and actually generated C code, even though it wasn't C code. It was interesting.
Well, that's really interesting because, see, you're actually getting at, we don't know how to write computer programs that do what that corn plant did.
I had another question about that, by the way, because I hadn't read about her research. The results, the way you've described them, and there's a lot more to it, I'm sure, could have been described by a self-correcting code where the information was distributed, in a holographic format or, error-correcting code, but or like a hugely redundant error-correcting code. Did she eliminate that possibility in terms of, because they didn't even know about DNA in 1951?
That's right. They didn't fully even understand what it was. I mean, they could see chromosomes in a microscope, but they didn't understand the nature of DNA, right? So that's a really great question. And as far as I can tell, it's kind of a combination of both. So in other words, the genetic, what the plant did, there was redundancy and there was other information, but it rearranged the information in a completely original way. It did something.
The original, it did something new.
It did something new. And Barbara, for those who think this is an interesting question, Barbara wrote a Nobel Prize paper in 1984, and it was called something like The Response of the Genome to Challenge, where she actually examined very carefully that there are situations that happen over and over and over again across a population of plants that will produce predictable responses by the plants. Like, when we expose it to too much heat, it will do this, and we expose it to too much cold, it will do that. But she also studied what happens when you do something that's probably never been done before. And the answer was the plant will do something it's never been done before. And it's a novel response to challenge. And that's what, like, any software programmer or engineer should be just intensely interested in knowing what's going on. Because if we knew that, then we would have a quantum leap in software development and ability to write self-modifying code.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a lot of thoughts on this myself. We probably have thought along similar lines over the years. But this leads me to an interesting question. No set of operational code ever existed without having an environment to execute in. So my question to you is, what environment does this code execute in?
Well, I don't know if you're going to be satisfied with my answer, but the best answer I can give you is the environment is the cell. And, as far as we can tell, half of the information that is transferred, like when a reproduction happens, it comes through the cell itself, not through the DNA. There's a whole bunch of other things. And so the cell, like the DNA builds the cell, but the cell also builds the DNA. The cell modifies the DNA. So there's like this MC Escher, like, the hand that draws itself sort of thing going on. And it's just mind blowing. And like, And I can tell that you're asking me a question at a level of which I don't have enough programming experience to probably even contextualize an answer for you. And so I apologize, but I do think I sense where you're going. And like, this is a fantastic question to be asking.
This is your show. So I won't say too much more right now. Maybe some other time we can correspond. But since we're short on time, Miguel has a whole bunch of more questions that he wants to cover about you and your book.
There's so much more, and for the reader, definitely check out his book. I see a whole symphony in evolution. I see transpositioning, horizontal gene transfer, epigenetics. There's so much, and again, even for somebody like me who is scientifically challenged, I get it. But another very interesting idea you bring up, Harry, is most of us have been told, well, like most of us have been taught neo-Darwinism, most of us have been taught just basic physics, that there's only matter and energy in the universe. But you bring a very insightful argument that there is matter, energy, and information, right?
Yes, I do. And you can't, we all know what information is, right? Because we text each other and we send emails and all that, right? And, you send somebody an email and you could read it on your cell phone, or your wife could read it to you in the car or whatever, but it's still the same email, right? So information is not inherently attached to any one physical thing, right? It's, Shakespeare is Shakespeare no matter what form it comes to you in. Okay. Well, this is not something that can be reduced to matter or energy. So there was a famous MIT professor. He's called the father of cybernetics. His name was Norbert Wiener, and he said, "Information is information, neither matter nor energy." And no materialism which refuses to accept this can survive the present day. So what he was saying is, he was one of the fathers of the information age. And he said, now that we recognize that we're in an information age, we have to recognize that information is this whole property that you can't weigh it on a scale. You can't power a generator with it, yet it shapes all living things, right? And it's found in all languages and everything, right? And so this completely blows apart the purely materialistic notion of the world. And it goes back to my prize, because nobody knows how to get from matter to information, or from energy to information. So where does information come from? Well, this goes to the deepest questions in philosophy. Where do minds come from? What is consciousness? What does it mean for you and I to be sentient beings? All of these questions are wrapped around the information question.
And you would say this also comes to the idea of consciousness, because religions have been wondering what consciousness is. The secular agents really don't know. I mean, even Sam Harris himself admitted, we have no idea what consciousness is. How would you define consciousness, and as it relates to Evolution 2.0, or even your own ideas, Perry?
Well, consciousness is the ability for a being to be a self in relationship to other things and beings, and to have a relationship, an awareness of past, present, and future. And as far as I know, you need some kind of consciousness to create information. So I believe that, number one, consciousness creates information, not the other way around. Okay. I think it's actually consciousness first. That's my belief. I can't prove that, but it makes sense based on everything I know in engineering. Secondly, this is a whole nother rabbit trail that we don't have time for. But if you study quantum mechanics tells you that you have to have consciousness first to even have an observation. And so you have to have an observer to collapse a potential quantum event down to an actual quantum event. So there's a way of interpreting quantum mechanics that says that the universe wouldn't be here if we weren't here to observe it. And so there's a book by Biocentrism called Robert Lanza that's all about that. It's by the same publisher that published my book. Well, this suggests to me that the whole universe is consciousness and information first, matter and energy second, which is a complete reversal of the normal assumption that most people are taught in universities. But as far as I can tell, it absolutely has to be true. The matter first explanation doesn't make any sense.
And to put things to rest, as you write, randomness really can't work because, as you write, information chaos or anything you introduced into language, code, or whatever, it's simply going to break down. It just can't work for life.
Right. And so nobody understands this better than a communication engineer, right? So, people use their iPads and all that, and that's great. But if you've ever designed a device that does that, like I've spent part of my career designing audio equipment. I spent another part of my career doing networking equipment. Noise destroys. Okay, randomness is noise, and noise destroys. Okay, so noise always destroys a signal. So, in your car radio, if like how AM radios are particularly susceptible to interference and stuff, right? If so, you turn on an AM radio, and then in the next room you turn on a hairdryer, and that motor is making all that noise, and you hear all that static. That static never, ever, ever, ever improves a signal. It's always your enemy. And Darwinism is literally based on the belief that static and errors in the signal occasionally make better and better fish, better zebras, evolve zebras into giraffes, or, and no, it's not possible. And so there's this whole order and structure that's coordinated by the cell that most people have never been told about. And so there's mysteries and mysteries and mysteries inside the cell that we've barely even begun to plumb.
Yes, and you like to quote a band I really like, Rush, and we both know that static just would ruin Geddy Lee and the rest of their work. It's just good stuff.
That's right. Sometimes our circuits get shorted with external interference, right?
Yes, indeed. And lastly, Perry, and that's again for some naysayers out there, what do you say when people tell you, and again you address this in the book, that you are using analogies, that these are chemical reactions, that this is not really code in the real sense?
So there's a famous scientist named Hubert Yockey, and he died not too long ago. He's about 100 years old when he died. He lived a long time. And for years, he was the leading bioinformatics guy. And he wrote a book. It was called Information Evolution and the Origin of Life. And in that book, he clearly explained, he said, when we talk about information and codes and copying and error correction and all that in biology, none of these are analogies or metaphors or anything like that. They are literal terms, and they come from information theory, and they are fully applicable to genetics and everything. And so, in fact, there's a whole field called bioinformatics, which is where information technology and biology overlap, which is exactly where I'm at. So my book is like bioinformatics for high school kids. That's kind of what it is, And so, no, they're not analogies. And you, like, nobody's explained where the information in life comes from. And so, we need to pursue these mysteries, and we need to respect how deep these mysteries go. And we can't afford to sweep this stuff under the rug. And let me tell you why. Here's why we can't, this is not just some academic thing. So now there's two areas that are just blazing speed, driving forward with tremendous force. So one of them is gene editing, and the other one is AI. All right. So gene editing, we can now edit genes almost as easy as like cut and paste Microsoft Word, which was really scary. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of people that think that the millions of years of evolution were all just random copying errors. And now for the first time, we're going to take charge and do this intelligently. And they don't know that every cell in that chicken they're dissecting is better at writing code than a team of Google engineers. Okay. And so, you know, there's a real danger of making a Frankenstein, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
And then we have AI, right? Well, you know, we don't know nearly as much about AI as we think we do. And I think there's a lot of hubris in the whole AI world. We're going to have the singularity and we're going to have immortality by the year 2045. And I think there's a real lack of humility. So when you have something as powerful as AI or as powerful as genome editing, and you mix it with hubris and pride and people making assumptions that really aren't warranted, you really have a recipe for disaster. And all you got to do is read a few science fiction books, and you might start to get an idea what could go wrong. And so I just really want to caution people, like, this is an urgent front burner issue in our society. This is not just some pedantic argument about Darwin or whatever. No, this is like modern, 2018 technology being applied to solve real problems. And we have to do this right, because, if somebody releases some, biovirus or, decides they want to kill the human race with some new form of bacteria, you don't get a do-over on something like that.
Not at all, and I agree with you. I don't think we should be Luddites, but like you said, we should have humility and know that playing God never works out for humans.
Yeah, we have a responsibility to steward the earth that we've been put in charge of, and that includes healing nature and fixing birth defects and stuff, but we have to learn from nature with our 2 ears before we start talking with our mouth.
Well said, and a good way to end. So I think we have reached the end of the interview. Thanks for keeping us company, Vance.
Oh, my pleasure. I've been listening with great fascination.
And thank you very much for coming on, Perry, and giving us an incredible interview on your book, Evolution 2.0, and the rest of your work. It's great stuff, and really appreciate it.
Well, people can get 3 free chapters of Evolution 2.0 at cosmicfingerprints.com. And it's also on Amazon and Audible. So whatever, hardcover or Kindle or audiobook, whatever suits you, it's out there. It will change the way that you see the hand at the end of your arm.
I agree. It definitely changed mine. Well, again, thanks for being here, Perry. And thank you so much for coming on Aeon Byte.
Well, hey, thank you very, very much. And it was an honor to talk to both of you. Great questions, great depth to the things that you wanted to talk about today. And I'm really honored. Thank you.
And there you have it. A truly stimulating interview with the most awesome Perry Marshall on his book, Evolution 2.0. What did you think? As mentioned, this is the complete interview for reasons given in the introduction. But for members and patrons, we sojourn to a Gnostic three-way to discuss more on evolution, DNA, intelligent design, coding, and more from a Gnostic perspective. It will include the Moondog Vance, who is a combined man of science, recovering occultist, and a veteran computer engineer who has actually worked for the deep state without losing his divine spark. And as well as Scott Smith, author of God Reconsidered, a perennial guest who has written extensively on the failure of both conventional theism and atheism, opting for the middle but dangerous path of Gnosticism. His book, God Reconsidered, touches on many of the points that Perry covered. We'll certainly continue and expand this discussion in our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group with members and patrons. Again, it's sort of a new thing, so let us know. I won't go on my logoria of the benefits of becoming a member. So please go to thegodabovegod.com and click either the member or Patreon buttons halfway down the page for more information. Regardless of where you stand, I'm glad you're here evolving with us as we fumble to individuation and cosmic liberation. You being here is no accident, not random. But is it providence or damnation? The Gnostics would say both. So for members and patrons, stay with us and let us to our Gnostic threesome with no marketing name as of yet. For non-members, you'll get a small tease of our discussion and then hear the record scratching for the end. But nothing ever ends, as Dr. Manhattan told Ozymandias. This is a new thing. Welcome those for members who are here, and non-members, you will get the small part, a tease of this section. It's something new, something we hope to build upon. You might call this a Gnostic threesome or a Gnostic menage a trois, whatever you want to call it. The marketing department still hasn't gotten back with their decisions, but so glad you're here. And with us, we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Scott Smith, as I mentioned in the introduction, author of God Reconsidered. How are you doing, Scott?
I am ready to pontificate.
There you go, on your soapbox, I hope so. And joining us again, who was with our interview with Perry Marshall, is Vance. How are you doing tonight, Vance?
Oh, not too bad. I'm ready for our trimorphic paranoia.
I like that. That might be a good name. Good call. Again, we'll have to let the lawyers look at it. But anyway, again, this is something new, and we are promoting it as an addendum or a great compliment. One of our great members of the Inner Sanctum of Gnosis, Jim West, has written an extensive spanning article on evolution, his take on Perry Marshall's great interview and book. And that article will be on the same week that this show is coming on. So please check out thegodabovegod.com and read Jim's interview. Again, it will complement all of this. And we hope you like it. And, of course, always give us your feedback. Furthermore, this discussion will certainly go on if the listener wants, at our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group. When I post the interview, I'm sure I'll be there, Jim will be there, and, of course, Scott and Vance will be there so we can talk evolution, computer programming from a Gnostic perspective, or whatever perspective you want to talk about. So with that all said, giving it a little perspective, so tell us, Scott, why don't we start with you? Tell us what you thought of the interview, and of course I should tell the listener that your book, God Reconsidered, does deal with many of the same themes that Perry Marshall does, specifically in your chapter 4. So tell us about that, Scott.
Yeah, I started the book out very gently, the Trojan horse approach to not scare off believers in religion by talking about the defects of the arrogant materialist atheist movement that, unlike some atheists of the past, are very narrow-minded, intolerant, and I showed that they are really irrational rationalists. They claim to be rationalists, and so when you talk about certain things that they don't like, they really get nuts. And I tried to push their buttons on ESP and UFOs and afterlife. And so then having kind of taken that gentle approach, the next 3 chapters were aimed at traditional believers of religion, East and West. So I started out with the question that is addressed by Perry about, is there evidence of intelligent design? And for those in the audience who might not be familiar with all this stuff, evolution is kind of bandied about, but there are really a lot of different theories about the details. Generally, it's these days called neo-Darwinianism. And intelligent design was intended to kind of be a sophisticated version of creationism. Creationism being more of the kind of the literal or sometimes a more liberal interpretation of Genesis to try to make it conform with the evidence. And so Perry took a really original approach, which is commendable, to try to go down the middle and show the weakness in the dogma of neo-Darwinism and say, something, the idea that he accepts the basic evidence for evolution, but the notion that all this came about by accident, by a bunch of random chance, doesn't make sense, he argues, and I think he is right on that. So I think the book does a great service in the budding literature that addresses this narrow-minded materialist irrationality in showing that the dogma is not correct. Now, we've talked before on other shows about Thomas Kuhn's classic work, where he looks at how intellectual ideas get accepted by the establishment. And the academic establishment is always about 2 generations behind the cutting edge evidence. And I think that what Perry's talking about eventually will be more widely accepted, that in fact, as he says, we don't have the answers to how life started and many, many other things, consciousness, as Vance has talked about. And so this notion that, we have it all figured out is exactly like what happened at the end of the 19th century when they said, we've got the universe down pat, we got all the laws, we just have to work the ether into this situation. And we know how well that worked out, but they don't learn from their mistakes. One of my favorite authors, I think it was John Hout, who wrote God and the New Atheism, said, I believe it was he, that neo-Darwinism is basically the new creation mythology. And so you have that same kind of militant adherence to the dogma. So what Perry has done is important in making people realize we don't have all the answers. We should keep an open mind. And of course, the greatest minds in scientific history and physics especially did keep open minds. And I think he does one other thing that's important, which is he warns about the hubris of gene editing, artificial intelligence. I don't know if in the book, he didn't talk about it in the interview, but nanotechnology, I think Elon Musk has warned about the dangers there, possibly, or maybe it was AI, I'm not sure. But, there are some very significant things that need to be discussed. And the skeptics tend to put, everybody who's a heretic from the official academic position in any field, in a box and labels them, superstitious. I've been recently online arguing with some of these idiots. There really is evidence for acupuncture. It's been used for 5,000 years. They've done scientific meta-analyses, but no, these guys say there's absolutely no evidence for acupuncture. So he's really thrown a grenade into the discussion about evolution, creation, and all the related issues. And I think it'll do a lot of good. And I think it will also bring some of the creationists kind of back into the fold where they don't have to insist that God created everything in 6 days. He's giving them a middle path.
Yes, Perry does. He's not a young Earth creationist, and he definitely goes that route in his book. I don't know about it against him, but his arguments are against young Earth creationism. And it's interesting about the acupuncture because, it was Richard Nixon and his staff who went down to China in the 70s, and he witnessed open heart surgery with acupuncture. I mean, back then it was all there and it's all documented. So it's very interesting. But what I wanted to say too, which I haven't said in the introduction or the interview with Perry, was that evolution was something that the Greeks certainly contended, and even St. Augustine believed in evolution. They didn't have the data we had, but this was something that philosophical mind and through just rudimentary science you could figure out. But now moving on to Vance, I know because of Perry's time constraint during the holidays and I had the flu and so forth, we weren't able to extend the interview. So I know you had some takes on it, Vance. So let the audience have it.
Sure. I was fascinated by the interview, and I had thought the same things that Perry had thought. And there's even something that I mentioned briefly in the interview, which was every code, and to briefly summarize Perry's argument, or at least one of the major points of the argument, was that a code had to have some sort of intelligent coder because no code has ever created itself, and he challenged people to give him an example. And I'm along with that argument. But here's the interesting thing. The DNA code, as far as we know, is from the beginning was capable of generating every life form we have ever seen now or in the past, and presumably any life form we'll see in the future. So from the very get-go, that code and the mechanism in which it executes, namely the cells that the code generates, that mechanism actually had the entire design of life in every species, so that no matter what the environment, something could develop and evolve within the environment that would match the environment. That to me is just earth-shattering. And another thing that people don't realize is that it's a very well known phenomenon that the minds of animals and people have pre-programmed information from birth. We call them instincts, reflexes, and so forth. But birds' migratory abilities and how to take care of yourself, how to fly, right? Birds can kind of teach themselves how to fly. That's all embedded in their brains. And the DNA code, assembled into chromosomes and the genetic material, generates brains. It has the actual instructions on how to construct a brain, and also the mechanism by which the brain seems to operate, at least for storing memories and so forth, besides the electrical impulses up and down the axons and neurons and so forth. That is the same type of code called RNA. So when you look at all of that, to me, it is so obvious that intelligence is embedded into the very fabric of the universe. That's the complete thought that I wish I had had time to discuss with Perry. And I'll leave that for your comments.
Yeah, Jim West discusses that in his article, his excellent article that's up on the site. So, and maybe a little roundtable on the next question. Scott, what has been your experience with intelligence design, or does this fall into the Gnostic argument that we really have a very unintelligent design in the universe?
Well, first of all, I haven't read Perry's book, but just judging by the interview, it seems that he is making an argument that at the cellular level, the cells are kind of guiding their evolution. So there's an intelligence at a very fundamental level. I don't think that this is an argument for a guided creation process. And there are lots of arguments against that, starting with the fact that it took 3.8 billion years from the first single-cell organisms. And, you would think that if you were an all-powerful God, you might have been able to move along the dinosaurs and not take 150 million years till you realize they were not really going to evolve into brilliant beings, and then you brought in an asteroid to kill them and start over. It seems a little kind of late in the process. Now, I don't frankly think aliens, if we want to posit another possible demigod to guide the process, that they would be that dumb. I mean, if they can travel faster than light in the wormholes and, get here and like in the movie Prometheus by Ridley Scott, they would have they would plant the seeds and then kind of watch over them and so forth. If they can do all that, I think they could have moved the process along. I think we could move the process along in our laboratories today. So I would say that in terms of kind of this middle ground of saying it's not random, and I think that argument he makes very well. There are a number of people that I quote in God Reconsidered who kind of make this point. David Berlinski, who he describes himself as a secular Jew, and he wrote this great book called The Devil's Delusion, Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions. And he says a number of interesting things about whether we can accept this dogma that there's no intelligence, whether it's from God or aliens or at the cellular level. He says, Western science has proceeded by filling in the gaps of our knowledge and then creating gaps all over again. The process is inexhaustible. Einstein created the special theory of relativity to accommodate certain anomalies in the interpretation of Clerk Maxwell's theory of the electromagnetic field. But general relativity is inconsistent with quantum mechanics, so the largest visions of the physical world are alien to one another. Anomalies have grown great because understanding has improved. Many physicists argue that some elements of intelligent design are needed to explain cosmic order. So, I think that we could concede that
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.